The Soviet Union's decision to invade Afghanistan was a major mistake, and it resulted in a terrible war. The conflict was incredibly violent and caused a lot of suffering. Soviet soldiers faced constant danger from rebel fighters who fought hard to resist their advances. As the war went on, the Soviet soldiers became desperate to go back home, but their mission remained incomplete. The war between the Soviet Union and Afghanistan in the 1980s had a significant impact on global politics for the next 20 years. The Afghan rebels, known as the Mujahideen, bravely fought against the powerful Soviet army. Even though it seemed impossible, they surprised everyone with their determination and strength. The Mujahideen received help from different countries, both with resources and encouragement. What were the reasons the Soviets decided to invade Afghanistan? How did the invasion happen? And what were the after effects of this invasion? Many believe that this long war played a major role in deciding the Cold War's outcome and had a lasting effect on Afghanistan's future. Afghanistan, a graveyard of empires. Afghanistan is a landlocked country located in a challenging region between powerful nations. Throughout history, various forces from India, the Far East, the Middle East, and the West have tried to pass through Afghanistan but have failed. It has gained a reputation as the graveyard of empires. Originally, Afghanistan was inhabited by different tribal groups who lived in isolated valleys, disconnected from the outside world. In the 19th century, the region became of interest to the Russian and British empires, who wanted to expand their territories. The borders of Afghanistan were established as a buffer between these two empires, resulting in the arbitrary mixing and splitting of ethnic groups. In 1919, after several attempts by the British to control Afghanistan, the country was recognized as an independent emirate and later a kingdom under King Mohammad Zahir Shah. During the 1960s, Afghanistan embarked on a process of modernization under the king's rule. Urban dwellers celebrated the introduction of elections, political rights, and women's education. At the same time, the Cold War intensified, and Afghanistan became a focal point for the rivaling powers of the United States and the Soviet Union, both seeking influence in the country. However, internal tensions arose when Mohammad Daoud Khan, the king's cousin, staged a bloodless coup in 1973, establishing the Afghan Republic. Daoud Khan faced opposition from different ethnic groups who felt neglected, particularly the Pashtun people split by the Pakistani border. In response, Daoud Khan cracked down on civil liberties, which led to discontent among both left-wing and traditionalist groups. In April 1978, a revolution supported by the Soviet Union ousted Daoud Khan, bringing the Communist People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, PDPA, to power. The new government, led by Prime Minister Hafizullah Amin, implemented radical policies aimed at advancing women's rights, equality, and socialism. These changes disrupted the traditional way of life for self-sufficient rural communities, leading to resistance against the government. Amin's oppressive measures and disregard for dissent sparked riots in March 1979. In an attempt to maintain control, Amin had President Nur Mohammad Taraki killed and assumed the presidency himself. This further weakened the government's stability and fueled resistance from rebel groups. Recognizing the deteriorating situation and fearing the spread of the Islamic Revolution from neighboring Iran, Soviet Union leader Leonid Brezhnev decided to intervene directly. The Soviets aimed to remove the unpredictable Amin and restore order in Afghanistan to prevent the collapse of their rule in Muslim areas under Soviet control. In 1919, Afghanistan became independent after British attempts to control it. Under King Mohammad Zahir Shah, the country was modernized in the 1960s. People in cities and towns were happy to have elections, political rights, and education for women. During the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union were interested in gaining influence in Afghanistan. In 1973, a cousin of the king named Mohammad Daoud Khan peacefully took power. However, he didn't pay enough attention to the needs of different ethnic groups, especially the Pashtun people who were divided by the border with Pakistan. Daoud Khan became more controlling and restricted people's freedoms, which made both left-wing and traditionalist groups unhappy. In 1978, there was a revolution supported by the Soviet Union. The Communist People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan took over, led by Prime Minister Hafizullah Amin. Amin made big changes to improve women's rights and equality, but these changes disrupted the lives of people in rural areas who were used to taking care of themselves. They didn't like the new government. Amin became very oppressive and didn't tolerate any disagreement. In 1979, there were riots against him. Amin had the president, Nur Mohammad Taraki, killed and took over as president himself. This made the government even weaker and led to more resistance from rebel groups. The Soviet Union was worried about the situation and didn't want the Islamic Revolution from Iran to spread to Afghanistan. they decided to get directly involved. Their goal was to remove Amin and bring stability back to Afghanistan to avoid losing control over Muslim areas under their rule. The invasion of the Soviet Union. Let us dive deep into what caused the Soviet Union to invade Afghanistan. The Great Game. The historical rivalry known as the Great Game between Great Britain and Russia over control of southern Asia heightened Afghanistan's strategic importance. The fear of Russian encroachment on British colonies in Pakistan and India led Britain to closely monitor Afghanistan and its potential alliances. Unstable leadership. Afghanistan's unstable leadership and the risk of it falling into Western hands compelled the Soviet Union to intervene. After a coup in 1973, Afghanistan's leader Mohammad Daoud Khan sought support from various nations, including those viewed as enemies by the Soviet Union. This defiance prompted the Kremlin to orchestrate the Sour Revolution, installing a pro-Soviet regime. The Cold War. The Cold War rivalry between the Soviet Union and the United States intensified concerns about Afghanistan aligning with the U.S. When Hafizullah Amin assumed power, hinting at a more balanced foreign policy, the Soviet Union feared increasing American influence in Central Asia. To safeguard its interests and prevent closer ties between Afghanistan and the U.S., the Soviet Union decided to invade. The Brezhnev Doctrine. The Brezhnev Doctrine, which aimed to protect socialist governments, deemed any threat to socialist rule as a justification for intervention. As Afghanistan's government showed signs of fragmentation and a potential shift away from socialism, the Soviet Union saw it as a direct challenge to its interests. To uphold the doctrine and prevent Western countries from questioning its resolve, the Soviet Union prepared for military action. Ethnic uprisings. The Soviet Union faced the internal challenge of ethnic uprisings within its diverse population. Islamic states in particular witnessed a rise in religious leaders and ideologies that posed a threat to socialist regimes. Concerns arose that if Afghanistan moved away from socialism, it could inspire similar movements within the Soviet Union. This further motivated the Soviet Union to intervene and maintain control. Early invasion. On December 24, 1979, the Soviet forces entered Afghanistan, claiming it was due to a friendship treaty. They quickly targeted communication centers to disrupt the country's network and took control of the capital, Kabul. 3 days later, President Amin was assassinated by Soviet special forces at the Tajbeg Palace in a successful operation called Storm 333. Babrak Karmal, seen as a more moderate communist, became the new president of Afghanistan. By early 1980, approximately 80,000 Soviet troops had entered the country through different routes. Their objective was to gain control of major cities and highways. The international community strongly condemned the Soviet invasion. Most Islamic countries in the UN General Assembly passed resolutions protesting the intervention. Despite the Soviet claim of aiding the Afghan government, the international community and the Afghan people saw it differently. The invasion created widespread opposition among Afghans who viewed foreign intervention as a threat. The patriotic spirit and defense of Islam among Afghans made it clear that a quick withdrawal of Soviet forces was unlikely. The unpopularity of the war among Afghans became a recruitment tool for Mujahideen groups, who set up their headquarters in Pakistan. Throughout the conflict, around 6 million Afghans, about one-third of the population, were forced to flee their homes. Afghan refugees comprised a significant portion of the world's refugee population in the 1980s, with millions seeking refuge in Pakistan and Iran. These refugee camps, especially those in Pakistan, became recruiting grounds for individuals joining the jihad cause. It's important to note that the migration wasn't solely driven by ideology, but also by Soviet military tactics. From city to village campaign initially, the Soviet strategy focused on defending cities and roads while avoiding large-scale operations in rural areas controlled by the Mujahideen. However, they later adopted a more aggressive approach aligned with President Karmal's From City to Village campaign in 1982. This campaign aimed to extend communist control from urban centers to rural regions, intensifying the conflict. The Soviets would attack villages suspected of harboring the Mujahideen, often resulting in reprisal attacks on civilians by the Mujahideen after targeting Soviet convoys near those villages. Afghan historian Mohammad Hassan Kakar described the Afghans as victims of a deliberate attempt at genocide. The Soviets used brutal tactics like massacres, rape, forced displacement, destruction of crops and irrigation systems, and extensive use of landmines. These actions were meant to break the spirit of the Afghan people and the Mujahideen, but instead strengthened their resistance. Foreign assistance to the Mujahideen. The Mujahideen's determination was crucial to their victory, but they also received significant support from other countries. The United States, aiming to weaken their Cold War rivals, secretly helped the Mujahideen through Operation Cyclone, a large covert operation led by the CIA. The U.S. provided money to support the Mujahideen's fight against the Soviet Union. At first, the US was cautious about getting too involved in Afghanistan, fearing the potential consequences if the Mujahideen failed. They didn't want it to become another damaging blow like the Vietnam War, which had caused public aversion to overseas conflicts. However, as the Mujahideen's resistance grew stronger, the US increased its military assistance. The US sent aid to the Mujahideen through Pakistan's Secret Service, the ISI. The Pakistani government, led by President Mohammad Zia-ul-Haq, fully supported the Afghan resistance. Pakistan accommodated millions of Afghan refugees and provided training camps for the Mujahideen. This support served President Zia's political ambitions and also diverted attention from Pakistan's nuclear program. Saudi Arabia and Iran were also major contributors to the Mujahideen's cause. China, despite being a communist country, aided the Mujahideen against their Soviet communist rivals. Private donations also played a significant role, with a large portion of the funding coming from individuals rather than states. The Mujahideen's strength and the foreign aid they received made them an effective force against the Soviets and their Afghan communist allies. The Mujahideen employed guerrilla warfare tactics, taking advantage of Afghanistan's difficult mountainous terrain. Their numbers are estimated to have reached up to 250,000 fighters. They used hit-and-run tactics and ambushed convoys, initially relying on outdated rifles but later obtaining AK-47 Kalashnikovs as their preferred weapons. One major challenge they faced was the Soviet gunships, such as the Mi-24 Hind gunships, used in search and destroy operations. To counter this threat, the Americans began supplying the Mujahideen with Stinger missiles in 1986. These heat-seeking missiles were used to target Soviet gunships. Some experts believe that the introduction of these missiles had a significant impact, although their effectiveness is debated. Mujahideen leadership. The Mujahideen had leaders who formed political parties, and the most influential group was the Peshawar 7 based in Pakistan. They received support from the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan. The Hezb-e-Islami Party, led by Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, was the most prominent within the Peshawar 7 and received the majority of aid. However, Hekmatyar faced criticism for being more interested in his power than in defeating the Soviets. According to CIA officer Graham Fuller, he spent more time fighting other Mujahideen factions than killing Soviets, and he has been accused of ordering assassinations and attacks on fellow Mujahideen during the war. Another leader, Ahmad Shah Massoud, was associated with the Jamaat-e-Islami Party. Massoud gained praise in the Western media for his tactical brilliance in guerrilla warfare and was nicknamed the Lion of Panjshir. However, his actions have also been questioned. Throughout the war, Massoud made deals with the Soviets, and in 1983, he signed a truce with them, agreeing not to attack Soviet convoys passing through the strategically important Salang Tunnel. Some criticize him for allowing the Soviets to focus on other parts of the country and implement harsh tactics against his fellow Afghans. The Afghan Jihad was a complex conflict with many major players, and it cannot be simplified to the extent that some Western journalists portrayed it. Massoud's ceasefire with the Soviets exemplifies the multifaceted nature of the Afghan resistance, raising questions about how a leader who made deals with the enemy can be regarded as a leader of the resistance. The retreat. In 1985, a new leader named Mikhail Gorbachev took power in the Soviet Union. He wanted to end the war in Afghanistan and started giving more control to the Afghan Communist government. They replaced President Karmal with Mohammad Najibullah, who was told to make peace with the opposition and bring an end to the fighting. They proposed a program of national reconciliation and made changes to the constitution to include Islam. The Afghan Communist government was weak and wanted to share power with the Mujahideen, but the Mujahideen leaders didn't trust the communist government and didn't want to make peace with them. However, Gorbachev needed to find a way to withdraw from Afghanistan, which he described as a painful situation. Finally, in April 1988, the Geneva Accords were signed by Afghanistan, the USSR, Pakistan, and the USA, and the Soviet forces started to leave the country. The Soviets realized they couldn't win the war and were struggling to maintain control. They decided it was time to leave and started talking to other countries about how to exit. Even though they knew the Afghan army was not ready to handle the rebellions, they handed over the responsibility anyway. In 1985, the unprepared Afghan forces took charge with Soviet support. 1986, the Afghan armed forces had 302,000 soldiers thanks to Soviet training. The Afghan leaders begged the Soviets not to leave because they feared losing control. The Afghan people were clearly against the Soviets. The decision to withdraw coincided with Mikhail Gorbachev becoming the leader of the Soviet Union in 1985. Gorbachev had different ideas about politics and wanted to focus on improving the economy, which wasn't possible while the Soviet Union was stuck in a war in Afghanistan. So, without a real plan, Soviet troops started leaving combat in May 1988. The Kremlin negotiated ceasefires to ensure their troops could safely leave Afghanistan. This happened again in November 1989 for the remaining Soviet forces. Once all their troops were back in the USSR, the Afghan armed forces were left to keep the government in power, but things fell apart quickly. In 1992, Mujahideen guerrilla forces took control of Kabul and the government. Instability and small internal wars began soon after that. The aftermath. The Soviets invaded Afghanistan to control the government and prevent a pro-Western administration from taking over. However, they ended up with an extremist regime in power, which was just as bad. Unfortunately for the Soviets, their fears came true. The people of Afghanistan united to force them out. The war caused the deaths of around 1 million civilians and approximately 125,000 Afghan, Soviet, and rebel soldiers. In the end, an extremist regime took over, and the Soviet Union collapsed. The Mujahideen leaders were angry because they were not included in the Geneva talks. By February 15, 1989, the last Soviet soldiers had left Afghanistan. The Soviet Union lost around 15,000 soldiers, but the war had a devastating impact on Afghanistan. Between 500,000 to 2 million Afghans died during the conflict. 1/3 of the population had to flee the country, and over 1 million Afghans were displaced within their own country. More than 2 million Afghans were left injured, and there were over 10 million unexploded mines scattered throughout the country. The future of Afghanistan was grim. The war had affected an entire generation of Afghans who grew up in a state of war. After the Soviet withdrawal, the country remained plagued by war and conflict. The Soviet Union itself collapsed within 2 years, leading to the independence of its constituent states. The United States reduced its involvement in Afghanistan as its main goal of weakening the Soviets was achieved, but it still provided financial aid to the Mujahideen until the fall of the Afghan Communist government in 1992. The impact of the Afghan-Soviet war on global affairs cannot be underestimated, as it contributed to the rise of militant Islamic fundamentalism. Osama bin Laden, who fought alongside the Mujahideen against the Soviets, would later establish the terrorist group Al-Qaeda. Afghanistan continued to suffer after the war. It took 3 more years of fighting for the Mujahideen to overthrow the Afghan Communist government in 1992. This led to a bitter civil war among the Mujahideen groups, which lasted for 4 years and resulted in the destruction of Kabul, the capital city. The civil war finally ended in 1996 with the emergence of the Taliban. Even today, after 41 years of war, Afghanistan remains in a state of conflict. Conclusion. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan began on December 24, 1979. Soviet troops were airdropped into Afghan cities, heavy artillery breached the border, and the Afghan president and his ministers were poisoned by the KGB. This invasion sparked a 9-year civil war, resulting in approximately 1 million citizens losing their lives and the country being razed to ruins. The Soviet Union intervened in support of the Afghan Communist government in its conflict with anti-communist Muslim guerrillas during the Afghan War, 1978-92, and remained in Afghanistan until mid-February 1989. The war settled into a stalemate, with Soviet troops controlling the cities and major garrisons while the Mujahideen operated freely in the countryside. The Soviets attempted to crush the insurgency but were generally unsuccessful. The war became a quagmire for the disintegrating Soviet Union, and they ultimately withdrew in 1989. The invasion and subsequent war were met with worldwide condemnation and marked a watershed event of the Cold War. The conflict had devastating consequences for both Afghanistan and the Soviet Union, with significant loss of life on both sides.